Just gonna give it one more minute. Sorry. All right, we'll go ahead and get us started. Thank you all for joining us this evening. I'm Jess Ambler. I'm the director of the Eleanor D Museum here at Collins University. I am very grateful to be presenting our two speakers this evening who are going to be talking about topics related to one of our current exhibitions, Cultivating History, Food, Crops, and Art. I should also say that we are very grateful to the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts for loaning us this exhibition through their Loan Partner Program. And I also want to give a shout out to one of our GLAM certificate students whose capstone project is featured in the exhibition. So Hannah Thompson did an amazing job of curating a vitrine of objects related to the exhibition. So this evening we have two speakers, and I'm going to introduce both and then hand the floor over to them. Our first speaker will be Rachel Fugate, who is the Exhibitions Registrar at the Delaware Art Museum. She joined DelArt from Lehigh University Art Galleries, where she was the Collections Manager and Registrar. Previously, she was the Collections Curator at the DeVos Art Museum at Northern Michigan University. Rachel holds an MA in Art History from Syracuse University, where she focused on British art of the 18th century. And our second speaker will be Richard Conway, who received a PhD from Tulane University, a historian of colonial Latin America. His research interests include the social and environmental history of Mexico. He's associate professor and chair of the history department at Montclair State University in New Jersey. His courses include early Latin America, the history of Mexico, and indigenous societies in Latin America. His book, Islands in the Lake, Environment and Ethnohistory in Xochimilco, New Spain, was published by Cambridge University Press in 2021. Rachel.
Thank you, everybody, for joining this evening. Thank you to Jess, Janet, Lana, Reagan for inviting me here and allowing me to present my research. Admittedly, it has been like 10 years since I have delved into Mary Delaney and her paper garden. And so it's been a delight to really, for lack of better words, unearth her and repot her and watch her grow. Okay, enough of the bad puns. The Flora de Lancia, or the 18th century name for the collection of Mary Delaney's botanical artworks, consists of over 1,000 cut paper collages, which she called paper mosaics. These works followed it in the tradition of genres of botanical art, including herbals written by the learned men of earlier centuries, and also the 18th century, botanical prints created by the hands of male scientists and enthusiasts, and the Hortus Siccus, or the pressed flower books, created by both men and women. Mary Delaney created her first collage as a second-time widow at the age of 71 and worked until her vision failed her. A close look at Old Tiger's Ear reveals much about Delaney's creative processes and distinctive style. As you can see here in the close-up, the works consist of many small cut paper parts glued together and layered. Each collage or paper mosaic is small, roughly the size of a sheet of printer paper, so is able to be held within the hands. Mary signed each of her work with her initials, seen here in the bottom, in the bottom right corner in red. Some works are labeled with the Latin name and a common name, and some of the collages exhibit the plant's Linnaean classification name, which was the standard classification system for botanical science during this time. And that you can see at the top center of this particular piece. Several of the works have supplemental information related to a location and or an individual who gifted the particular specimen. Seen here on the back side of this sheet, Mary noted, quote, a Chinese plant by the name of Wanga At Tong the Chinaman, as he called himself. Occasionally, as seen in Old Tiger's Ear and in Black Bryony, Mary inserted the actual plant material leaf, and you can see that here. We're incredibly lucky that the organic matter survives today in some capacity and also has been documented. Mary Delaney's collages invite viewers to look closer, to consider the context in which they were produced and what their heightened naturalism and botanical accuracy meant despite their artificiality. The Flora de Lancia harnessed the admiration of both her friends in high society and also the men associated with the field of botany with whom she became acquainted. Augusta Hall, known also as Lady Lanover and subsequently was also Mary's niece, wrote that her aunt's collages were, quote, the admiration of botanists such as Sir Joseph Banks, Dr. Solander, etc. When compared to an engraving created by renowned botanical illustrator George Dionysius Errett, one can begin to appreciate the fine details executed by Mary Delaney and understand the visual context for which I discuss her work. The image on the left is a hand-colored engraving by Errett, and that on the right was created by Delaney. Each image of the Persian buttercup not only focuses on the flowers, but also the individual parts of the plant. In both the images, all the plant parts are inherently different, and the composition invites viewers to examine the every dimension of the plants. By comparing the two artworks, one sees how the paper collages of Mary Delaney's straddled the line and the boundaries between craft and botanical illustration. In thinking about the exhibition Cultivating History, the VMFA curators invite guests to consider the role that horticulture and botany played in the expansion of empires from the 15th to the 19th centuries by asking the question, what is domestic? And so too, my research about Mary Delaney and her botanical creations seeks to explore many layers of domesticity. Her numerous collages reflect domesticity as defined as female accomplishment, the private sphere, or the activities of the home. Relations of those in a close-knit group of people. And lastly, domesticity as quote-unquote the native, or relating to national borders or one's place of residence. Delaney's extensive creative output is arguably the product of several factors. One, a society in which the natural world embodied the domestication of both women and natural specimens from across the globe. Two, a patroness and close friend with deep wealth and wide social connections. Three, residences at homes central to Britain's social scene that helped to cultivate Mary's scientific pursuits within the constraints of 18th century propriety. Mary Delaney's collages, Mary Delaney's collages, as signifiers of female accomplishment, help to define domesticity in relation to the home, the activities of the home, and the 18th century notion of the private sphere. Within this time, accomplishment referred to any activity or skill refined by a woman that enhanced her sociability, or, in other words, allowed a woman to show off all of her her skills that she could cultivate in lieu of working. Activities such as needlework, fiber work, shell work, and paper cutting serve as examples of the sort of art and craft work practiced by a quote-unquote accomplished woman. What we see in many of examples of women's craft work at this time are motifs related to the natural world. These examples reflect the gendered division of botany and gendered spaces of the public and the domestic. For most women, the study of nature was to be undertaken within the proper social boundaries in the private spheres of the home. Morality centered largely on the 18th century notion of the accomplished woman, and craftwork provided an acceptable outlet during the course of a day. Craftwork provided an activity that prevented women from participating in activities that could lead to ill outcomes, such as gadding about, idling about, writing, and reading. It provided a foil for such negative characteristics and affirmed women's place within society. To use the words of scholar Amanda Vickery, quote, "Female craft dignified the patriarchal home," end quote. Craftwork took place within Britain's private sphere, and as an activity undertaken by accomplished ladies, it reflected the man of the house and hence the public perception of the family. Within Britain's upper class of the 18th century, the flower garden commonly was perceived as a feminine setting within the larger estate. The garden provided an appeal to the senses and was thought to be an ideal place to study curiosities and the inclinations of women. Under this belief, the garden could be considered to be a place for women to indulge their senses without crossing the boundaries of proper comportment. Scholar Sam George asserts that because botany was a highly rational and industrious study that discouraged superficiality, it was perceived by some to be beneficial to the female mind. Like needlework and craftwork, botany encouraged attention to detail, and it even discouraged sinful behavior. Within this frame, we can understand Mary Delaney's collages as signifiers of female accomplishment, meant to mask her interest in Enlightenment science and Linnaean botany. The pieces blur the lines between scientific observation, the love of nature, between public and private spheres, between women's craftwork and dutiful replication of nature. As a woman of the upper classes, Mary was aware of the impositions placed upon her gender and strove to stay within the confines of proper social behaviors, though clearly subverting social expectations in a successful manner. The collages created by Mary Delaney mark a significance in the way that material culture often moves within close-knit groups of individuals. As I previously mentioned, each of these botanical prints or collages are roughly the size of a piece of printer paper. The tools and materials needed to create each work of art were also small enough to pack and take to any location to which Delaney traveled. The tools and case seen here were gifted by Queen Charlotte, with whom Delaney's social circles overlapped. The diminutive size echoes the details seen in each work and reminds viewers of the literal painstaking effort that went into creating each collage. The time, effort, and care poured into each of these works reinforces the significance as markers of close-knit groups. Due to the paper size and scale of the details, only one or two people can view the work at any given moment and obtain the full effect of their nearly natural representation. Each of Delaney's paper mosaics reveal an intimate relationship between the artist, the craft, and the viewer. In a sense, the artwork becomes a personal memento. Mary's works functioned as part of the visual culture specific to her social circle. As cut paper collages, these works lay outside of the realm of quote-unquote high art. They were not formally disseminated as scientific illustrations, and at the time could not be easily replicated. I propose that the intended viewer for the collages would have been somebody closely acquainted with Mary Delaney. They did not function as illustrations for a general audience or even a strictly scientific audience. The expansive archive of Mary Delaney's personal letters records the gifting of a small number of collages to individuals within her social sphere. Augusta Hall, Lady Llanover, records correspondences between Mary Delaney and a Miss Hamilton, upon which Miss Hamilton requests, on behalf of the Queen, that Mary Delaney take a specimen sent, presumably with this letter, and reproduce it within the medium of paper collage. Delaney did take up this request, as her niece writes, and produced actually 2 paper mosaics from that particular sample. The illustrated plants did not all come from Mary's private gardens, or even from the gardens at Bulstrode, the home of Margaret Cavendish Bentnick, also known as the Duchess of Portland, where Mary resided later in life. Delaney received plant specimens from some of the most well-known English gardens during the late 18th century, including Kew Gardens, like the begonia that we see on the left there, the Chelsea Physic Garden, like this pomegranate here on the right, and from the private botanical collections of Sir Joseph Banks. Each plant cutting she received as a gift pinpoints the places and people with whom she held in close contact. Many of the collages contain inscriptions stating the identification of where or from whom each of the depicted plants she obtained those, and also a date and location where she created the piece. Mary Delaney carefully recorded the individuals and places associated with the images. Thinking about the people and geographic locations from where Delaney created each piece reveals a cultural geography of her domestic sphere. The important locations range from Delville, her home in Ireland, to London, which spans a large part of the British Isles. Bulstrode was perhaps one of the most important locations for the creation of Mary Delaney's collages. Delaney spent much time at the Duchess of Portland's estate during and after her second marriage, up until Mary's move into royal quarters at the end of her life. Significantly, this estate was an important site for the study of nature in 18th century England. Not only did the Duchess possess a large collection of natural curiosities, but also the gardens at Bulstrode were filled with numerous specimens of both native and foreign plants. The home had been a destination for important members of the scientific community since the 1750s. Delaney's intimate friendship with the Duchess of Portland brought her into contact with some of the greatest botanists, horticulturalists, and botanical artists of this time, including the aforementioned Sir Joseph Banks, Daniel Saltender, John Lightfoot, Dr. John Fothergill, Philip Miller, and George Dionysius Errett, among many, many, many others. These men became a vital part of the process behind the creation of the collages. Access to original plant material was crucial to the process of composing such a wide range of collages. The men she came into contact with while at Bulstrode, conveyed scientific relationships formed and exchanges of gifts and knowledges. The sources of Mary Delaney's botanical knowledge helped to locate her within a greater map of the scientific community and the intersecting points with her own social milieu. Each of the collages portrays an intricate network of friends, of family, and locations important to Mary Delaney. The frequency in which female handicraft was given as gifts during the 18th century suggests both the prestige and the power that they had to connect women. The exchange of botanical specimens and the paper collages between Mary Delaney and the many important scientific minds she encountered reinforces the cultural map created by these exchanges. The artworks come to signify domesticity as relations amongst a close-knit group of individuals. Lastly, the collages created by Mary Delaney signify domesticity vis-a-vis the empire and the British nation. The domestic realm here refers not to the home, like a physical structure or a place of humans, and of close-knit relations amongst friends and acquaintances, but to the domestic as the nation and the familiarity of the nation. Both the subject matter and the medium of Mary Delaney's works reflect the expansion of the British Empire during the 18th century and domestication through the trade, the collection, the cultivation, and thus the control of anything foreign. Mary Delaney's art reflects an interest in the growing empire, in the colonization of geographic regions far outside the British Isles. The broad geographies of each specimen reproduced in Mary's work range from the native and long-cultivated plants of Britain to the botanical curiosities of North America, like the magnolia here on the left, to the plants from the edges of the empire, like the Asiatic crinium found here on the right, which is like native home is in tropical Southeast Asia. The plant specimens and their reproductions do not simply reflect the geographic locations of the British Empire, but also the British men who colonized these areas, brought the specimens back to England, and collected and controlled the distribution of this knowledge and commodity, thereby domesticating the foreign. The gifts Mary Delaney received from Kew Gardens, Chelsea Physics Garden, and Joseph Banks were very important to this discussion. These gardens and Banks himself cultivated large quantities of foreign plants. This reflects the interest and growing popularity within the field of botany within the 18th century, and then also well into the 19th century. Many of the scientific names Mary inscribed on the collages had actually never been published in public documents, but are used in the personal papers of both Banks and Solander, and reveal how entrenched Mary was in Britain's botanical circles. Her inscription choices reveal not only the personal acquaintances obtained through her residencies, but also the geographic locations represented in the British Empire. The cultivation of plants collected by Banks and Solander on English soil submits the collages as an act of domestication themselves. Moreover, in a letter to Delaney dated the 17th of September, 1781, a Mrs. Boscawen, who was a friend, complimented Delaney on the completion of her 9th volume of the Flora Delancea. She stated, quote, "I congratulate you on completing your 9th admirable volume. Their duration will be equal to that of the oak, which you close them so properly, and so like a good English woman, if English women in return were but like you." Through her multi-volume series of botanical collages, Mary Delaney earned the respect of her peers, with the hope that they endure beyond her lifetime. Mrs. Boscawen adores and uplifts these works as quintessentially English. Through all that the collages signify, they encapsulate all that represents English people and hence the expanding empire Expanding empires in which they live. As a widowed woman with the right connections and the drive to obtain knowledge, Mary Delaney acquired and cultivated the foreign into something with which she was intimately familiar, thus showing how domestication could be achieved through female accomplishments. In conclusion, Mary Delaney's botanical collages can be seen as multivalent symbols representative of the society she lived in. Her Fortis Sigus is arguably the product of several factors. A society in which gardening had evolved into a means of displaying wealth, knowledge, and taste through the acquisition of exotic plants. A close friend and patroness with abundant wealth and connections, as well as scientific and botanical interests. Residencies at the heart of social scene that drew numerous visitors of various social strata. A personal interest in natural history and gardening, and artistic talent and accomplishment, all of which were highly fashionable. The collages reflect domesticity defined as female accomplishment, the home, the private sphere, or to the activities of the home, relations to those in a close-knit group, and lastly, domesticity as quote-unquote the native, or relating to one's country of residence. Thank you.
These questions at the end.
Good evening, everyone. We have a few connections between what might initially seem like disparate topics. First is I'm British, I'm reasonably domesticated, and I'll be talking about empire in a moment. A different empire. Before I begin, I'd like to just say thank you for coming this evening. It's a pleasure to be at College University. I'd like to thank the staff at the museum here. I was in for thanking Reagan, Laura, Janet, and Jessica Amber, and all of you again for coming. So tonight my talk is about the art, as you see, of Aztec agriculture. I'm going to focus first on agriculture and then move to art. And you'll see some more overlaps between the wonderful images that Rachel just presented and similarly beautiful images from Mexico. I want to begin with a rather kind of simple premise. Trying to see how I advance this slide. The arrow keys aren't working. There we go. I use the trackpad. I'm going to start with a fairly simple premise, which is that there's an awkward and difficult kind of simple understanding of agrarian societies as rather backwards, right? The city versus the countryside. Those stereotypes are enduring, unfortunately, and what happens is we often have a conversation where there's an agricultural revolution in kind of large anthropological terms, and then once societies have agriculture, you then get the rise of complex societies. I want to kind of dispel this, challenge this, in a variety of ways. One is to talk about the complexity of agriculture here and how agriculture itself has, right, in lockstep with increasingly complex societies, greater degrees of complexity itself, and that art and agriculture can be intertwined, and we can see parallel trajectories of increasing complexity over time. So the focus for this will be the Aztec Empire, which you see here shaded in orange, and in particular, I want to focus on, actually, if I go back here, you'll notice a little area of blue here. This represents the area which today is Mexico City, or the Greater Mexico City area, which was, at the time of the Aztec Empire, located in a beautiful setting. Well, it's not a beautiful setting today, but one that then was filled with lakes. So you have the mountains surrounding it. Here's the Aztec capital, Tenochtitlan, which itself was an island capital. So I'm drawing attention to this lake environment because the lakes themselves served as a wonderful foundation for agriculture. And in ancient times, Native American peoples basically started by cultivating plants near the shore because there was ready access to water. And the lakes down here are freshwater lakes. This one is a bit more saline. So here was really a kind of agricultural heartland. And at the beginning, Native peoples would dig trenches away from the very shallow shores with shallow lakes, and the shorelines they had a pretty low gradient, and so you could dig trenches and allow the water to flow inland a bit and expand agricultural farmland. Over time, this became increasingly complex in ways I'll show you in a moment. But I do want to focus on this area here where there's a tremendously fabulous, bountiful, and complex system of agriculture that comes into being over time and reaches its peak during the time of the Aztec Empire. Now, quickly, I want to introduce a little bit of artwork, and in particular, show you the images around the border here. This is a famous scene from a book called the Codex Mendoza, which this might not be readily apparent. This is a cartographic history. So what we have here is the story of the founding of Tenochtitlan, and as you'll know from the Mexican flag, you have the eagle landing on the cactus with a serpent in the claw. Right, this is part of the legend of how Tenochtitlan was founded. And these symbols going around it represent, these are called year signs. And so this is a calendar. So here's a chronology of how change happens over time. This is a map, geographical representation of Tenochtitlan, the 4 different component parts to it. You can see in the Roman alphabet, the word Tenochtitlan has been written here as a gloss. And you have the rulers who lived here. Now, you have here, notice the diagonal blue and the square or the rectangle of blue. This indicates water. So it's pointing to the island situation of Tenochtitlan. Here's Mexico City today. Lakes are gone. Deliberate campaigns through from the 17th century, but particularly into the 20th century to drain these lakes. And all that remains really of this old aquatic world of the Aztecs is a place called Xochimilco down here, where the pit is. And you can see this kind of triangular shape here, which reflects those southern lakes that I showed you earlier with the fresh water. This is essentially what is left now, centuries later, of this old aquatic world, of this wetland agriculture. And you can see here the kind of almost cross marks. These are wetland agricultural fields, which I'll describe in a bit more detail in a moment. There's a little bit of a lake. But you can see here's the city itself of Xochimilco, which has now been kind of absorbed into greater Mexico City. But this is what's left of this old farming world of the Aztecs. Here you can see a different view of these plots of land. It's a kind of aquatic garden agriculture. So when I said earlier that the ancient peoples would dig trenches away from the shoreline inland to provide irrigation, over time, native peoples moved the other direction and went into the lakes because these are shallow water lakes, not very deep at all, maybe just 6, 8, 10 feet at the deepest places where the farming is possible. Essentially what native peoples did was dredge the soil from the bottom of the lakes, compact it, build it up, mix it with plants, and have willow trees planted around the edge to hold the sides from subsiding into the water. And this became an incredibly bountiful form of agriculture. For one thing, the climate is conducive to year-round cultivation. It's beautifully irrigated. There are ways of protecting against frost because of the presence of water and a variety of complex elements of science, which I'm afraid I'm not going to explain. But what you see here are close-ups of these little islands. They're often called floating gardens. They don't float, they are in fact built up out of the lake. And they're called chinampas, coming from the DelArt language of the Aztecs. Chinampas are just this incredibly bountiful form of agriculture. Some scientists and agronomists have calculated or estimated that this is probably the most bountiful form of farming devised before the 19th century, anywhere in the world. There's multiple cropping, crop rotations, again, annual harvests, that can just constant cultivation. It's an intensive form of agriculture, but it has tremendously high yields. And it's only really with modern pesticides, herbicides, and other innovations like that that we see greater harvests. So the point here is that over time, we get more complex societies with more complex agriculture in lockstep with one another. Again, I want to focus on this area here of the shallow freshwater lakes. And something that's really quite remarkable. Oh, by the way, that image of the triangular shape, that's what's basically here. Just to orient you. The area with the diagonal green shading, this reflects the kind of peak of this chinampa system of farming, this wetland agriculture. And what happened was, with the expansion of the Aztec Empire and the increasing complexity and sophistication of the Aztec Empire, its ability to harness the resources of tens of thousands of laborers, we had enormous, incredibly intricate engineering works to regulate the flow of water in these lakes. You have lots of little hydraulic compartments created. Essentially, little compartments where water levels could be regulated carefully to ensure ideal conditions for the farms, the raised gardens, the chinampas to flourish. So here you can see, right, this was this incredible state-sponsored, state-controlled, centrally planned transformation of the environment. So you can see what would have been lakes, the whole area becomes basically one of the most productive areas of agriculture on Earth and helps sustain the Aztec Empire. Right, Tenochtitlan had a population of probably 55,000 people at the time when the Spaniards arrived, making it bigger than any city in Spain, Seville being the largest at that time. And it's not just Tenochtitlan, Xochimilco had 30,000 people. Other cities had 40, 50,000 people. There are estimates that the basin of Mexico, the area of what is today kind of Greater Mexico City, had as many as 1 million people living there. So the carrying capacity of this land was tremendous. So again, the complexity. I want to go back. This little area here, this is an island around which you have these chinampas. And here's a colonial era map depicting it. And here is an aerial photograph from 1936, before modern day urbanization finally took over the landscape and transformed it. And you can see, right, these, they're a little faint, but the lines, these are the chinampas still being visible. They've now, unfortunately, in many places been, concreted over. So let's move to the art. Here is a map from the 1560s, thereabouts, 1570s perhaps, of Xochimilco, the city at the heart of this wetland agricultural district. You can see representations here of the garden, the raised gardens. You have the ruling lineages of people for the city. This is a bit of again, a cartographic history. And I want to draw attention to just the incredible sophistication of the artworks. There's, on first glance, it can look quite simple, right? You have fairly straightforward images of footprints indicating paths, roads. But when you get into this, you can see here, this bell-shaped object is a glyph indicating Xochimilco. And Xochimilco translates as the place of the flower fields, and you can see the little flowers dotted around it. So there were specialists who were literate, who knew how to read the glyphs and could read this aloud to people and interpret it to people. We're still struggling to this day to try to understand exactly what some of these things said. Here's a colonial era map, and again, you see the chinampas, you see water channels, canals basically going through the lakes, traversing the lakes. This is the same region represented in a map that is presented in a lawsuit over ownership of land. And this is where I want to connect the agriculture to art, because there's a really remarkable way in which the Spanish colonial administration accepted native language documents as legally valid before courts. So if you owned land or you had a map that showed land, that would be admissible as evidence in court, which leads to the survival of Aztec writing traditions. So we have these wonderful documents. These are ones I found in the archives in my research. This is the area that was subject to litigation, and you see the little wavy lines. These are reeds for lands that had fallen vacant because of catastrophic population collapse from epidemic disease, and because the land had been essentially vacated by people dying. It had gone essentially fallow inadvertently and had been taken over by not weeds but reeds with an R. And so the litigation was over who got to take over these lands. Here are some more of the chinampas. I want to draw your attention to these symbols here. These are measurements. And we have the introduction of the Roman alphabet here in colonial times. You can see this is in a bundle of documents in litigation. And so you've got the Roman alphabet being used so that Spanish audiences could understand the documents. Art historians have developed a great deal of work trying to interpret the glyphs and understand the images, the forms of representation, the graphic writing systems that were used. We'll talk about soil glyphs in a moment, but you can see here we have various kinds of measurement units. We have symbols representing homes or heads of households, which appear in some of those other images I've shown you. Here are some other representations of measurements that we see in the documents produced by the Aztecs. And here we are. We have the people's heads and profiles. These are the heads of households, the ones with their hair with, unlike mine, with little bits of hair on top. These are women who are heads of households. These are the lands they own. The different colors indicate different forms of land tenure, whether it's individually held or communal holdings. And yeah, these are measurements, representations of water. They're wonderful, right? On first glance, you might think this is a fairly straightforward, rudimentary, right, cadastral record, which is essentially a land record. But they're actually packed with incredible detail. Here's a really wonderful land map. And this detail from it, you can see the image, the glyph for the household or the house, and then the person who's then identified. So there's their names put in the Roman alphabet. Footpaths again, and then you see all the water traversing each of the, or surrounding each of the islands. And this is from around here, I believe. Somewhere around here. Yeah. Right, I'm going to move into the last section of this, which is getting to the herbals and other good images. We have here glyphs of soil kinds. So this is stony soil here. The one on the top is clay. But these can become incredibly sophisticated. So if you start with a simple representation of land, it becomes more complex. Is it alluvium? Is it clay? Is it hard pan or sand? And then, right, is it gravelly alluvium? And you can see the increasing elaboration of the artistic flourishes in these glyphs. So it's an incredibly sophisticated thing, right? You think about how you have maps of land which are incredibly intricate and detailed and full of all of this graphic information. And then you have writing systems that convey a lot of information, which to the untrained eye might on surface seem pretty straightforward, but it's actually pretty complex. And I'd like to then move on, because not just maps and records of lands are tied to the agriculture, it's also the herbals and visual images that native peoples created for us. So this is a wonderful manuscript called the Badianus manuscript, which is held in the Vatican Library. I've not yet had the chance to go and visit. One day, I hope to be able to go see this. This was produced by a couple of people, one called Martin de la Cruz and another man called Juan Badiano, who translated it from the Aztec language, which you can see written here in the Roman alphabet. And it's a herbal, used mainly for kind of medicinal or other purposes. And it was to provide information to the Spanish colonial administration, particularly with the Franciscan friars, who were the ones in the vanguard of working with native peoples, with the Aztecs, to understand who they were, to convert them to Christianity, and to have this kind of two-way communication, this cross-cultural interaction and exchange, sharing information about their worlds. And so we have these herbals. And I'm going to bring us back to those soil glyphs we just saw a moment ago. You can see them represented in the root systems of the plants. And so here are the names in the DelArt language of the plants. And it's really just a wonderful document. The people involved in the production of this were from Xochimilco. So from the very place of the great abundance of wetland agriculture. Just a glorious document. I've only ever seen it in facsimile form. And then here you can see very clearly those glyphs for soil. And I don't know, those things, right? Yeah, they're not salamanders, I don't think. Okay, I want to close with some images from a wonderful book called the Florentine Codex in Florence. It was given as a gift by diplomats by the Spanish crown, and ended up in Florence. And it's an encyclopedia. There's actually a wonderful online version of it if you search for the Florentine Codex. It's digitized by the Getty Museum and available online. And it has translations of the texts and the images and what have you. And it's a 12-book encyclopedia. The last book is about the conquest of the Aztecs, but the penultimate book is about forest, garden, orchard. Anyway, there's the title sheet for the 11th book. And I threw this picture in here for Jessica Amber because she loves cats, and here's a jaguar. And what they're doing here is they're explaining to the Franciscans and then to audiences overseas, far away, this is who we are, this is the world we inhabit, this is the life we've led, this is our culture, this is our history. Coming up through to the end of the conquest. And that history includes the pride in depicting agriculture, plants, and what have you, flora and fauna. But here we have flowers that are depicted. Again, places for flower fields for Xochimilco. Here are edible roots. And just the depth of information is wonderful. Here we have amaranth. You can see that. Here we are, frijoles, beans. And I'm going to end here where one part of the, well, several parts of the Florentine Codex have these wonderful accounts of personality types. The Aztecs were very preoccupied about order versus chaos. They didn't have the concepts of good and evil as we would in a Christian society. For them, it was order and chaos. And bad behavior was behavior that was conducive to disorder. Good behavior kept the world in good order. So here we have, and this is a translation provided by the Getty of the DelArt text here, describing, look at this lazy farmer sitting there not doing anything. So he's the bad farmer, he's a shirker, a lukewarm worker, a careless worker, one who drops his work, lazy, negligent, mad, wicked, noisy, coarse, decrepit, unfit. Compare that with the horticulturist. The Spanish version calls it the good farmer. The DelArt language translates to the horticulturist, and it's a planter of seeds, a broadcaster of seeds, a tree planter, as you can see. And where I'd like to end is to connect together agriculture with art. And do you remember that image of the cartographic history of Tenochtitlan, where I indicated to you the year signs that went around the perimeter to indicate the chronology? So the horticulturist is somebody who's diligent, solicitous, careful of things, dedicated, able, a knower of books. Isn't that lovely? A reader of the day signs, of the months, of the years. Thank you, everyone.
So I'm going to have both of you together. Do you have any questions from the audience?
I had a question about Mary Delaney's. I saw all those prints that talked about on black ink background or black ink paper. So it wasn't black paper, it was prepared in advance?
Correct. Somebody in a book that I read that I'm so sorry, I cannot tell you the details, but if you give me a day and provide me your email, it might come to me at 3 a.m. They have dug deep into like the materials of Mary Delaney's things and have like furthered this kind of like this argument about just how much of the empire and the empire connections went into making these things. Like some of the paper, they're like, oh yes, this came from Denmark. We know this by this, like the weft and the weave and all this like jazz. And like the inks, they have like chemically broken down and like have been able to say, yes, we know that they were bringing in materials from these places because of that. So they were definitely like a lot of that was prepared ahead of time, and like just the 18th century is also when we see a lot of like mass production of like paper things and materials for arts and crafts being done. So it's all very much part of that industrial revolution empire.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I have a question on the Florentine Codex, and maybe I missed something. It's why is it called the Florentine Codex?
Because
And it's about Mexico. I don't know. I'm just so confused.
yeah, it's because it currently exists in Florence and in the archives there. So it was a gift by diplomats to the city of Florence, or to at least to the rulers of the city of Florence.
Yeah.
It's an unfortunate thing. I mean, we have there are, for example, 3 extant pre-Columbian texts by the Maya. One's called the Dresden Codex, and the other's the Madrid Codex. So it's rather unfortunate that the geography of empire has left that.
Do you know what kind of adhesive she used for the collages?
I do not, but again, I think that same article talks about that. And again, I would be very glad to point you in that direction. I like, it's one of those moments where I'm like, I really wish I was a material science person, because like, those are some weeds I would love to get into, but unfortunately that evades my my knowledge base.
Question. I keep thinking about, I can't remember like where I read it or had, but like maps are always arguments. And like what is the argument that's being presented in the map, and the way that like space is laid out in a certain way, and then also time, where like generations of people are laid out. Could you say a little bit more about like who was making these maps, and then maybe how that intersected with that kind of space and time ownership or something like that?
Yeah, it might be easy if I go back to the image at the beginning. If I ever get that. I didn't realize I have this many slides. Yeah, the people who made the maps were the Aztecs had a distinct profession of tlacuilo, the person who was charged with writing or producing and storing documents. And there would be some groups of tlacuilos who would specialize in things like maps. And the system of writing before the arrival of Europeans was one that was a graphic system. So the distinction between writing and image wasn't clear cut, that the two overlapped, right? You could have images that conveyed information in a kind of graphic form, and then you have glyphs that add to that. So all of these things may just look like simple adornments on the map, but they actually they have meaning to the people who produce them. So in other words, there's a class of scribes, some of whom are specialists who do work with images, in particular that become like these. Some of these, this was produced for the Spanish monarchy. And so it was another example by which the native peoples wanted to explain their world. Mendoza was the first Spanish viceroy related to the monarch, Charles V in Spain. And so it's dedicated to him, hence we have the Codex Mendoza. And so I think resources were provided for the native peoples to produce these materials. And so you have the lovely, beautiful bright colors in this from the inks and dyes that are used. Now, as regards depicting time and space, it's really quite wonderful, because when there's actually a series of geographical reports commissioned by the next Spanish king, Philip II, who wanted to know what the empire looked like. And so he sent out surveys and questionnaires all across America saying, please send us information about where these places are, or tell me all about them, and he include a map. And so the native peoples from Mexico sent all these maps, and their conceptions of space were very different from the kind of newly emerging Euclid style kind of mapping in Europe. And physical space was defined by people and by ruling lineages. Right, so space is not something that's on a graded measurement scale, although that does exist as well, as we've seen with the land maps. But it's about human relationships. They're social maps. And so they blend these things. There's a really wonderful map from southern Mexico, which is globe-shaped. And then it has a lineage. I'll show you a similar one here. I'll be very brief, don't worry, I don't want to monopolize the question and answer session. But you see here, this is actually a genealogy. So here's the place. Here's one of the dynastic rulers, the king's families, and this is the line of succession go on. These are the previous rulers. Likewise up there, you see the umbilical cords connecting people. So this person here, Don Martin, I can't quite make out his last name here, is related to Doña Francisca de Guzman at the top here. And So this is a map of Xochimilco that is determined by certain things. And here we have Montezuma, the Aztec emperor, who was related to these ruling dynasties. And so it's an understanding of space in relation to here's one ruling lineage, here's another one, and then there's a third at the top. So there's a kind of complex interplay of space as something which is different from how we might understand it, and that then is also imbued with kind of chronology as well. Yeah.
Thank you so much.